2 years later, Star Trek squandered its most compelling story. When Star Trek Strange New Worlds premiered in 2022, it felt like a breath of fresh air for a franchise that had lost its balance between nostalgia and innovation. The prequel series managed to blend the charm of the original series with modern storytelling flair, anchored by Anson Mount's charismatic Captain Christopher Pike. It wasn't just another chapter in the Star Trek canon, it was a promise. A promise that the franchise could return to the ideals of exploration, optimism, and character-driven storytelling. But 2 years later, that promise feels broken. Despite a stellar start, Star Trek has once again found itself trapped by its own potential, teasing the most compelling story it ever set up, only to shy away when it mattered most. The tragedy of Captain Pike's fate, the moral complexities of Dr. M'Benga's wartime scars, and the political tension between the Federation and the Klingons, all the threads that could have elevated modern Trek to its best era, were either softened, sidelined, or abandoned. 2 years later, it's clear. Star Trek squandered its most compelling story. The setup. Pike's doomed destiny was Star Trek's perfect tragedy. From the very beginning, Strange New Worlds built itself around an irresistible hook. Captain Pike knows how he dies. We first learned of his grim future in Star Trek Discovery, where he saw the accident that would leave him disfigured and confined to a life support chair. Unlike other captains, Pike leads every mission with the knowledge that his days are numbered. That setup alone could have been the foundation for one of the most psychologically rich arcs in all of Star Trek history. Imagine a captain wrestling with mortality not in a metaphorical sense, but with a literal countdown hanging over his head. Every away mission, every moral choice, every act of compassion could be seen through the lens of that fate. For a while, Strange New Worlds embraced that promise beautifully. In early episodes, Pike's calm demeanor was laced with quiet dread. His mentorship of Spock and Una carried a fatherly warmth tinged with melancholy. The series even hinted at his attempt to defy fate in subtle ways, almost daring the universe to prove him wrong. But as seasons progressed, Pike's tragedy was reduced to a background detail. The story stopped being about a man staring into his destiny and became a string of disconnected adventures. The show that once seemed ready to explore death with dignity instead drifted toward comfort zone storytelling. By the end of its second season, Pike wasn't a tragic hero anymore, just another captain in a familiar formula. Dr. M'Benga's Klingon war trauma. The story Star Trek was afraid to tell. If Pike's arc was Star Trek's grand tragedy, then Dr. Joseph M'Benga's was its moral reckoning. The reveal that M'Benga was not just a doctor, but a hardened veteran of the Klingon War added rare emotional gravity to Strange New Worlds. It painted the gentle healer as a man haunted by the lives he took, and the ones he couldn't save. Season 2's Under the Cloak of War was a masterstroke. It finally peeled back M'Benga's scars, revealing a brutal, haunting truth about what Starfleet's peacekeepers were capable of in war. His confrontation with the Klingon ambassador Dakra, a former enemy turned self-proclaimed pacifist, was the kind of moral duel Star Trek was built on. But then, nothing. The episode ended ambiguously, implying M'Benga might have killed Dakra in cold blood. It was bold, disturbing, and ripe for exploration, a character-defining moment that could have sparked a season-long reckoning. Instead, Strange New Worlds just moved on. The next episode reset everything, as though the show was afraid of its own darkness. That's where modern Star Trek stumbled hardest. For all its talk of complexity, it refused to live with consequences. The franchise that once challenged viewers with the ethical dilemmas of The City on the Edge of Forever or In the Pale Moonlight now seemed reluctant to commit to moral ambiguity. M'Benga's arc could have been Star Trek's equivalent of The Last Jedi's Luke Skywalker, a story about the cost of idealism in a morally gray universe. Instead, it became a one-episode experiment that was quietly swept under the rug. The Klingons. From existential threat to comic relief. It's ironic that the Klingons, once Star Trek's most layered and philosophical species, became victims of tonal inconsistency. In the golden age of The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, Klingons weren't just warriors. They were symbols of honor, tragedy, and cultural pride. Episodes like Sins of the Father or The Way of the Warrior use them to explore identity, loyalty, and the clash between tradition and change. When Strange New Worlds brought Klingons back, fans hoped for a revival of that complexity. The early seasons teased a fractured post-war galaxy where Federation officers still harbored hatred and suspicion. Dr. M'Benga's resentment and Pike's cautious diplomacy promised a story about reconciliation and the lingering wounds of war. Instead, the Klingons became caricatures again. By the time the show revisited them in lighter episodes, they'd lost their menace and moral depth. It wasn't just tonal whiplash, it was thematic betrayal. The Klingon War, which could have defined Strange New Worlds as a show about healing after trauma, became an empty backdrop. Starfleet officers who lived through unimaginable horror now act as if those scars don't exist. The moral weight of war was replaced by quips and nostalgia. The Federation forgot its own hypocrisy. One of Star Trek's most compelling through lines across decades was the tension between the Federation's idealism and its hypocrisies. Deep Space Nine mastered this theme, portraying a utopia that sometimes had to get its hands dirty to stay clean. Strange New Worlds flirted with that same idea, especially through M'Benga and Chapel's experiences in the war. There were glimpses of something extraordinary, the suggestion that Starfleet's moral clarity is not absolute, that its officers sometimes make impossible choices for survival. A series truly unafraid of its own premise could have examined how Starfleet's propaganda shaped the public perception of the war, or how officers like M'Benga carried classified guilt that no one wanted to confront. But rather than deepening those questions, the show backed away. The Federation remained spotless, and the difficult stories were left unspoken. 2 years later, the galaxy feels smaller for it. Star Trek's fear of change. Perhaps the real tragedy is that Star Trek keeps setting up the potential for bold reinvention, only to retreat to safe nostalgia. The first season of Strange New Worlds was a revelation precisely because it mixed optimism with emotional realism. It dared to show that even in the 23rd century, heroes can be broken. Yet by the midpoint of Season 2, the show had fallen into a familiar trap. The anthology format began to override character progression. While episodic storytelling can be liberating, Strange New Worlds used it as a crutch, resetting emotional stakes week after week. Pike stopped evolving. Spock's relationships became soap operatic distractions. M'Benga's trauma was forgotten. Even the Lower Decks crossover, while charming, symbolized the problem. It celebrated Trek's past rather than advancing its future. The show became a museum exhibit rather than a living story. Star Trek's greatest flaw right now isn't bad writing, it's fear. Fear of alienating fans. Fear of making heroes look too human. Waiting to be told. What makes all of this so frustrating is that the pieces for greatness are still there. Imagine a third season of Strange New Worlds that fully embraced Pike's knowledge of his fate, not as a burden,